With us today are the Athletics, David Ornstein, Matt Slater, and Everton correspondent Patrick Boyland as well. Okay, let's talk about Everton. The verdict came in a huge document. David, let's start with you. Can you give us a bit of background to this and how the appeal board came to their decision?
Yeah, the headline IO is that Everton had a 10-point deduction originally handed to them. That has been reduced by 4 points to 6 in total. So it sees them climb a couple of places in the table and maroons Luton, for example, because they have seen the team that was just 1 point above them move 5 points above them. It's all about the background. Everton were charged in March of 2023 with a breach of the Premier League's profitability and sustainability rules. It was a process that they were happy to cooperate with, but an independent panel needs to be set up to hear these cases. That panel felt they could not hear it in time for the end of last season, and there were no rules at that moment in time saying it had to be heard by the end of the season. So the panel was set up in October. They heard Everton's case. Everton did not deny that they were in breach of the rules. So clearly the panel had to take that into consideration. It emerged afterwards that the panel ruled that Everton had lost in excess of 360, I think around 360 million pounds over the 3-year accounting cycle. You are only allowed to lose a maximum of 105 million pounds. There are a number of add backs that are allowed, though, such as expenditure on stadium and other infrastructure, women's team, academy, and so on. The calculation that brought Everton's loss down to was 124.5 million pounds, which the panel said is 19.5 million pounds over the allowed limit. Everton argued that they were actually only 9.7 million pounds over the limit, but they were over the limit. They gave a number of mitigations around this, such as the loss of sponsorship deals with Alisher Usmanov being sanctioned and his company USM, who were a sponsor of Everton. Extra costs around the construction of the Bramley Moore Dock Stadium, etc. Even the loss of potential income for a player who was unnamed who left the club. At the end of that, Everton were handed the 10-point penalty. They were furious about this. They described it as being wholly disproportionate and unjust. A couple of months later, they decided and announced their decision to appeal against this. The appeal hearing was convened for late January, early February, a new 3-person board. By this point, Everton had taken on a renowned lawyer nicknamed Super Silk, Lawrence Rabinowitz, and he is said to have a good track record in these things. The hearing took place and we got the result, which we broke exclusively on The Athletic, that Everton's punishment had been reduced. That was the only thing that Everton were kind of protesting here, not the charge, but the scale of the sanction. They weren't allowed to present any new evidence. They raised 9 arguments. 7 of those were rejected by the appeal board. 2 of them were upheld. The first, that the original independent commission had essentially deemed Everton to have acted in bad faith. Well, the appeal said that that was not something you were supposed to be adjudicating on. So that's irrelevant, and there is no evidence that Everton acted in bad faith, but they did commit a breach. It was just deemed as a fact. Secondly, that no benchmarks were used by the original independent commission to formulate this 10-point deduction. There are precedents around English football, European football for profitability and sustainability breaches in the EFL and elsewhere on the continent. Or you could say Premier League's own punishment for going into administration is 9 points. Yet this was the biggest sporting sanction ever handed down by the Premier League. It was deemed by many to be extremely harsh. There was a consensus that 6 points is fair. And the appeal board ruled that they felt that 6 points was minimum, but proportionate and appropriate. And that's likely to set a precedent now, you could say. But in the process of this, and we must point it out amid all of Everton's mitigations, that the appeal board ruled that Everton did benefit from a sporting advantage. And so that is likely to cause, more consternation among the clubs that may have suffered as a result of this breach and been relegated last season. So that's the first case done and dusted. It's over. That charge is gone. But there is still a second charge to follow. It means we're only at half time in Everton's saga. And that's before we even begin to talk about other clubs.
Yeah, for sure. Paddy, I want to talk to you in a second about, what this means for Everton at this moment in time and also sort of reactions from fans. But Matt, quickly, just want to bring you in here. There's a piece that's landed today by Patrick and various other journalists on The Athletic talking about Everton's point deductions. Can I just ask you how they came up with the 6-point deduction? What's the mathematics behind it?
Well, yeah, and this is a really interesting part of the ruling. So the Premier League got themselves in a bit of a mess first time round. And this has been the subject of much conversation, really, in terms of what Premier League Chief Executive Richard Masters was actually doing in the first hearing. And I think, to be fair, some of the criticism has been over the top, because he was making a submission. As the Chief Executive of the Premier League, he was allowed to to declare the league's position, and this happens in all the other football disciplinary hearings. It's happened umpteen times in the English Football League. The problem the Premier League has is these rules, when they were set up, which is very much sort of post Portsmouth, it's almost like no one ever really thought that clubs would fail them. They were this very, very generous threshold. So it's 39 million in the EFL. It's 105 million in the Premier League. It's almost like the sort of founding fathers, the people that wrote these rules, just didn't think people would breach them. And, I think as people have started to realize that maybe people might breach them, there's been some conversation around, okay, should we have a schedule? Should we have some proper, benchmarking exercise here for what the punishment should be? And very late in the day, after the Everton process had started, they did produce some guidelines, but just guidelines. They were not set in stone. So the disciplinary panels that adjudicate these cases have always had incredible amounts of discretion. Basically, they can do what they like. They hear the case and they can set the punishment as they see fit. Now, again, people want to criticize and slam and personalize this. So, Masters has become the bad guy. The Premier League board has become the bad guy. Fans should never, ever forget that the Premier League is a shareholder organization. Masters is an employee. The board are set up by the shareholders. The shareholders are the 20 clubs in the Premier League at any one time, plus the FA. They're really the 20 clubs. Those are the key people to think about here. So if the Premier League did not have a fixed schedule of punishments for financial fair play breaches, it's because the clubs themselves wanted it that way. They were quite happy to give these, whoever they might be, because they are independent, and you never know who the people are until you put together a panel. So these three preeminent jurists and cases and financial experts would have the discretion. They did not want to put down a schedule. I think for one reason is they were very worried that some clubs, if they wanted to cheat, would almost see it as the price of business, right? If they knew, if I go 10 million, 20 million over, I lose this many points, or I get a transfer embargo for this many years, or I get a fine this big. Great. I will just factor that in and I will take a punt. I will, I'll roll the dice accordingly. So they wanted that level of discretion. So that's the background. That there is a reason why we have got to where we've got. There is always a reason. It wasn't just an accident. I would argue it was a mistake, though. And this is one of the key things that comes out from the appeal judgment. It was a mistake on the Premier League's part, i.e. all the clubs and the board. They didn't argue their case clearly enough at the last shareholders meeting, or the shareholders meeting where they addressed this, that the Premier League did not have a schedule. It should have had a schedule. It should have had a defined series of this is how we deal with you. If you are this much over, this is what you're looking at. If you're that much over, this is what you're looking at. Because the EFL have. The EFL have had one since 2018. So to answer your question, the appeal board agreed with Everton that the punishment was disproportionate. And I think David's point is absolutely clear. How really could this be more serious than an administration?
Yeah.
Because you do have a set tariff, an automatic set tariff for going into administration for an insolvency event, which is probably about the most serious thing that can happen to a club. And if that's 9 points, how can this be 10 points? How can this be more serious than that? So there's your first sort of thing that the appeal board had in their heads. You have got one set tariff. It's 10. So it's 9. So we are gonna factor that in. This feels like it should be less than that. I think most people, if you got on the Clapham omnibus, you spoke to rational people walking in and out of football grounds. Does this feel more or less serious than an administration? Less serious, right? Brilliant. So it should definitely be less than 9, right? So there's your starting point. Then they started to look at what the EFL does. Now the EFL schedule is quite interesting. They go on the basis that if you are over our level, if you have breached, it is 12 points. But then we work back from that. So we will take a point off 12 for every, it works out that their limit is 39. So if you're 15 over, anything more than 15 is egregious. And if you think their upper threshold is 39, if you are 15 over that, you're almost sort of 50% over that. That is, you've blown it by miles, and we're not getting any mitigation. That's aggravating factors. So if you're 15 over our 39, that's 12. But we will then take off basically a point for every 2 you get closer to 39. If you see what that means. So you start knocking off points to get to more like 6 just for a regular breach, or 3 for a really small breach, just for 2 or 3 million over. So that approach where you go top down and then you chip away as you get closer to the breach level, as you get closer to the threshold level. And whilst the numbers are different, so like I said, 39 in the EFL, 105 in the Premier League, the percentages actually work out. So Everton were basically 20 over, 19 and a half over. That almost works out at, if you'd applied the same principles that the EFL use, that's where you get to 6. But 2 other things, one other really big thing to mention here. Both the EFL and the Premier League will consider other aggravating factors. And actually, we actually got it properly spelled out in this appeal board ruling that the Premier League, back at the original case, wanted 12 points. They wanted 10 if you like for the numbers, but they actually argued for 2 aggravating factors, so a point for each aggravating factor. And one was this sort of principle of being less than frank and sort of misleading the Premier League on how Everton were going to deal with interest related to the stadium build. And another one was just on the amount, on the sort of size of the breach. The appeal board just ignored that and said, no, we don't consider those to be aggravating factors. So that's where you just get to, it's 6, right? It's 6 on the amount of the breach, and we are using the EFL schedule, which is the best available one we've got. You haven't got one, but there is one over there in a league that you have admitted your rule books are aligned. Clubs come up and down. Even when so the Nottingham Forest case is really interesting because 2 of the years that they are being measured on are actually EFL years, which is why their number is less than 105. So you can see where the appeal board is getting it from. Well, because you haven't got this we think quite important and useful piece of legislation, or legislation is the wrong word, but something in your rule book, there's this other body that you're very closely related to, that your clubs are very closely related to, that does. So we're going to use theirs.
Wow. Paddy, let's bring you in with the Everton hat on. Look, a small win for Everton because they're not fully out the woods yet. But, what are the clubs saying? What are the fans saying?
Yeah, I think the club feel vindicated over the appeal and their right to make an appeal. Obviously, the 2 key strands when you look at the original statement after the 10-point deduction were the idea that this was disproportionate, and that's obviously been proven true, correct. And the other element was that they felt that there wasn't enough kind of evidence given by the initial commission so people could understand how we got this far down the line, how we got to 10 points. There's no working out as such. So they will feel vindicated in that regard. I mean, the sense that I get is that they do see this as a small win, as you've described it in kind of scoreline terms. It's a 1-0 victory rather than the 3 or 4-0 win. Once you set the bar so high at 10 points, I think it's going to take an awful lot to get down below kind of 5-4 and more or less impossible to wipe this out entirely. Some of the key points here, I think, are that the commission, this new panel, and it was a new panel, they basically decided that 6 points is the minimum for a PSR breach, and that Everton's initial argument that this shouldn't be a points deduction at all didn't really pass water with them because they felt that any breach inferred a sporting advantage. The tricky thing with all of this is that, as Matt has mentioned, so little provision in the Premier League rule book, and the commissions themselves are given so much in the way of discretion that it's hard to follow any coherent logic from one case to the next. When Nottingham Forest's case is heard later this month and when Everton's case is heard next month for 22-23, we're going to end up with different panels again. And because of the level of discretion, they might actually decide that they place more weight on some of Everton's mitigating factors, that they don't agree with the EFL precedent and the close alignment between those two things. So all of this is up in the air, and all of it is a problem, I think, of the league's making, along with the 20-member clubs. But certainly there's a feeling that this is success for Everton, that they, I mean, in moving 50 up to 15th in the table, 5 clear of relegation, symbolically that seems to matter quite a lot for this club. And it's been interesting in recent weeks when we've heard from Sean Dyche. He's never really before now wanted to place lots of weight on the mental strain of a points deduction and what this uncertainty means for his players. But in the last few weeks, maybe as a self-defense mechanism, has started to concede that this may have been inadvertently affecting his players, that it might have been in the back of his players' minds. So the club's needed a boost. I mean, it was described to me by somebody as that it was like the club was in purgatory when we look at the decisions that need to come on a whole range of issues, including the takeover. And I think that uncertainty is probably no good for anyone. It's not good for club employees. It's not good for fans. I would argue it's not good for rival clubs like Luton Town and Burnley, Sheffield United, Brentford. I saw Christian Norgard talking earlier on Sky Sports after Brentford's game last night about how kind of damaging this process is for players.
As it affects people's lives, it's their livelihoods as well, right?
It affects people's lives because if a club gets relegated, it has severe implications, as we all know. So it's been a messy process. I think we've probably got where we should have been after the first commission. 6 points sounds a lot better than 10, and it obviously needed to come down below administration insolvency. But there are inevitable follow-up questions here as to what this means for Everton and Forest in the next hearings.
Well, that's the one. Let's move on to the small win for Everton, because 15 definitely feels much better, even though the points aren't that far apart than 18th. But David, how would this impact, the relegation battle in general? Paddy just sort of alluded to teams like Luton, Forest, Burnley, even maybe. It's going to be really fascinating because we've still got another hearing still to come at the end of the season as well.
Yeah, that's the big issue in this, is that it's not over by any means. We're only part way through the process, which just kind of underlines the mess that we're in. Football, largely in the Premier League now, seems like it's being decided in lawyers' chambers and courtrooms rather than on the field of play. I don't want to skip too far ahead of what we're going to discuss, but the second charge for Everton and the first for Nottingham Forest are now going to be held. They need to be wrapped up by sort of mid-April, but it's conceivable that if appeals are lodged and heard, that we won't get an absolute final conclusion until the 24th of May, which is what the Premier League has described as a backstop. It's 5 days after the end of the Premier League season. It's in time for the annual general meeting at which places are allocated for the subsequent season. And therefore, we could see the likes of Everton and Burnley playing on the final day without knowing if they're going to be in the Premier League next season or not. And that feels pretty farcical. I do just want to touch upon one point in all of this that we haven't mentioned yet. And I've seen Everton fans articulating it in some detail. Of course, there's anger at the Premier League. Of course, there was an uprising among fans and local politicians and others, and that will bring what Everton describe as a bit of satisfaction in the news. But there's also a lot of anger towards the regime at Everton in terms of Farhad Moshiri, who I think 8 years ago today completed his 49.9% investment in the club. And it appears he had the right intentions in terms of wanting to grow the club to compete with the big boys and in European football. He spent extremely heavily. And yes, there was the new stadium, which we all hope will be fantastic, not only for the club, but for the local area and the country too. But the commissions detail how Everton were warned about their excess spending, and at times they ignored these warnings and continued to spend. Now, the more recent trend has been to spend a lot less. They've really brought their house in order impressively, but it still might not be enough to see them escape second time round. And so Everton fans are continuing to express their frustration at the process and the Premier League. But there is also a realism in this. And that's why they were only appealing against the scale of the sanction as opposed to the breach itself, because the club, to a large extent, has been financially mismanaged over a considerable period of time. And everyone will hope that that improves going forward. And the final point in reference to what you said about other clubs is, whether we like it or not, some of them will feel this is too lenient. And I saw some comments below our story from rival fans saying 6 points is no deterrent for clubs breaching these rules. It should be a draconian punishment to make sure every club keeps their houses in order, like the majority have done. And so while there will be a little bit of muted celebration at Goodison Park and among the fan base, there will be frustration and fear at other clubs as well. And that's why we haven't heard the last of this.
I think David makes a really good point with regards to how people come out of this and how they look as a result of this. I would argue that no one party, neither the Premier League nor Everton, nor the original commission, look good as a result of this new verdict. One of the really interesting bits for me, as somebody who covers Everton day in, day out, from the report that we got on Monday, was the level of detail the commission went into with regards to Moshiri's project, if you want to call it that, at Everton. And I'd suggest that when you read it in full, you come to the conclusion that this breach and what's happened on the pitch since amounts to the complete disintegration and the complete failure of Moshiri's project at large. Everything that he gambled on, the idea of spending big early doors to get up the table, increase revenues through merit money, get into Europe, and then again continue that vicious cycle of kind of increased revenues, that did not pay off. And in actual fact, what we're saying here is that Everton had an inferred sporting advantage from a PSR breach, but have ended up in a much worse sporting situation because of how badly they've spent that money. So that they have completely wasted any sporting advantage they had and actually have gone backwards as a result of that spending. So that to me shows, with Moshiri seemingly on the way out, just how catastrophically wrong he got it. They're one party. I think the other thing here is that the Premier League let the cat out of the bag. David uses the word farcical to describe that back end of the 24th of May. We simply cannot have a case, a situation where a hearing after the end of the season is deciding who is being relegated. When we get to that stage, we devalue the sporting competition more or less entirely. And how far back do we want to go with this? Because Everton had 10 points taken off earlier this season and were plunged into a relegation battle. We've spoken about the psychological difficulties of that. What impact has that had on them? What impact has it had on other clubs? We were speaking off air, Io, about the idea of a good point. And nobody knows whether a draw away at Brighton, even when you concede in the 95th minute, is actually a decent result anymore. Not Everton, not other clubs. And if you want to go further back to January, if clubs had known about Everton's points reduction, would they have gone about the January window in a different way? It opens up a whole host of questions. And to me, we end up getting to the point where, because of the way this is being handled, the integrity of the competition is starting to be devalued if it hasn't already.
Matt?
Yeah, I'm just going to make a few points. I mean, this ruling is clearly good news for Everton. They've got 4 points back. They are very pleased with the part of the ruling that talks about that bad faith element. The actual phrase that the independent commission, the first one, used was less than frank. And I think there's a really interesting section on that. And the appeal board clearly didn't like that. And Rabinovitz played that element really, really well. There were these 9 grounds for appeal, but as the ruling reveals, he actually hammered home 2, really, in particular. They lost 7. And they lost 7 pretty, hands down. If you actually sort of, if you read the ruling, read between the lines, this was 3 other people going, no, 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 right? But the 2 he went on, which I think were Everton's strongest grounds for appeal, were this element in the first ruling around less than frank bad faith. And that clearly embarrassed Everton, right? So that's why it was important to them. And that comes across in their statement. And it was interesting from a sort of point of law, in that the Premier League didn't really even press that first time round. They didn't really push that as an aggravating factor. So that was the kind of mistake that the independent commission made. So we've got to be very careful here, and even our language, because we are feeding, I think, sometimes some false narratives on the part of Everton fans who are understandably upset, right? The criticism there is of the independent commission, not of the Premier League. The independent commission got that bit wrong. And you can read, it's quite funny when you read a lot of these rulings, how one lawyer is rude about another set of lawyers, right? The diplomatic language they use. And they clearly didn't like that phrase, less than frank. They pointed out that it's actually not a legal term. What does it mean? It's way too subjective. And it wasn't, as I said, a big argument the Premier League made first time round. But it makes sense to us, doesn't it? We know what they were meaning, that the Everton intentionally misled, they were obfuscating, they were being a bit devious. The Premier League didn't actually make that argument. But what comes across in the ruling, and this is where we shouldn't go too far the other way, like Everton's way, is that, hold on a minute. So if we actually sort of go read all of it, it's got nothing to do with the stadium build, I'm afraid. So this whole canal for the last 2 or 3 months, that Everton have been punished for trying to do this wonderful, good thing that we all agree with. No, they weren't. I'm sorry. Those costs were capitalized. And then in August 2021, there was written about in the first ruling that Everton fans and Everton, supporters, well, same things, but people who were kind of, talking on behalf of Everton fans just ignored this part of the ruling. One, your costs are capitalized, so they're taken out of profit and loss. They are not considered for FFP purposes. But then there was a further conversation, a further debate between club and league, and there was a settlement made in August 2021. Really important this, where Everton said, we had more costs, true, in the pre-planning phase, because it was a complicated bill, complicated site. We all know this, right? And they asked the Premier League, can we basically write off another 39 million? The Premier League said yes. Post factum, afterwards, just said, yeah, all right, okay, we'll let you write off another 39. We will not look at that for FFP purposes. And then the other side of the deal was you have to open your books, and this is the whole conversation that Everton fans often talk about. Well, we opened our books. They basically have worked to a salary cap for those key years, and the league and Everton had to basically ask almost permission, or certainly kind of run it past the league, if they were going to spend more than £5 million on a player. This is where we get this whole conversation around, but you knew exactly what we were doing. True, it is true, but it was because of a deal where the Premier League, once they did them a favour, but certainly looked at it generously, looked at the stadium build costs generously. So this is absolutely crucial. The idea that Everton had been punished for building the stadium is just not true. They were punished for overspending on players. And that comes across now in 2 long judgments. That's 2 different panels have looked at the same set of facts and have come to the same conclusion. So I think that's really, really important. Everton also asked for a mitigating factor, this idea of trend, i.e., direction of travel was good, right? Look at, we brought our costs down. That is true, but the way FFP works, it's backwards looking. You look at 3 years. It's actually 4 because of COVID, and they average the 2 seasons out. But just to keep in your heads that it's 3. Everton were already in breach after year 1 and 2 of the 3-year cycle. They were at £111 million breach, right? So going into year 3, the Premier League, like, guys, you're over. You know you're over already, don't you? So you actually have to make a profit in year 3. They gave them 2 warnings in that year, as Everton did not do things that the Premier League thought they should do. So this idea of trend, I think, is really interesting. You know, Everton claimed that first time round, and they'd let fans run with that idea. Not found, okay? Not found. And I think the other thing is, again, it came around in a lot of the conversation of the original sanction, this idea of we gain no sporting advantage. It was just a complete misreading of the first ruling. And now in this appeal verdict, we see it a number of times spelled out really clearly. Yes, you did gain a sporting advantage. You did. And that is why, and I think this will be interesting for Forest and for Everton second time around, they also come to the conclusion that for FFP breaches, the appropriate sanction is points. It is not transfer embargoes. It's not fines. It has to be points for this to be meaningful and for the integrity of the competition, and effectively, reward's the wrong word, but I suppose let's use reward. All those other clubs that don't breach the rules, they have to be protected, right? Let's worry about them and their fans.
David, that word trends Matt uses, I think, is very pivotal here in terms of how the Premier League are looking to go about their business, and especially, as is mentioned, around Forest and I mean Manchester City's 115 charges. What do you see those trends looking like, especially for those teams in question?
Yeah, Nottingham Forest have taken a very different approach, sort of subtle, not very public since the charge was announced. They've hired Nick DeMarco, KC, also a prominent lawyer in his own right, and the reports that this case is going to be heard next week. And Matt explained that because they spent 2 of the 3 seasons within that 3-year cycle in the Championship, their permitted losses are lower. When they came up to the Premier League, they spent very heavily on player transfers. Now, they received an offer or 2 from clubs for Brennan Johnson before the accounting cut-off period. I don't know, £30 million or something in that region. If they had sold him for that, maybe they would have complied, maybe not. But they knew that his market value was higher. And so they waited until the end of the transfer window. And they managed to get £47.5 million from Tottenham for him, which they will argue as a strong mitigation shows that they were maximising profit. However, that fell outside of the accounting period. So that will be a cornerstone of their argument. Clearly, they're in a difficult position themselves. And judging by what Matt has said there, pointing to the appeal board fine detail, a points deduction is certainly plausible, but we shouldn't prejudge that. That and the case of Everton, number 1 and number 2, are deemed as simple breaches. The Manchester City case is viewed as being complex. They were charged in February of 2023 with 115 alleged breaches of Premier League profitability and sustainability rules. They deny them all. They claim to have irrefutable evidence that will clear their name. They, of course, faced a punishment from UEFA for financial fair play breaches previously. That was overturned by the Court of Arbitration for Sport. partly on the basis of a time bar. Some of the allegations were limited in terms of how far back you could analyze these things. The Premier League doesn't have a time bar, and so that will obviously be very interesting. Richard Masters, Premier League chief executive, has said that a date has been penciled in. We don't know what it is, but there is an anticipation across football that it will be this year, 2024. However, there could be then appeals afterwards that take it into 2025. I think for the good of everybody and the view of the competition, we'd like to see this dealt with sooner rather than later. It's going to be an almighty legal battle. Clearly, Manchester City won, I think, 6 Premier League titles, a few League Cups, couple of FA Cups and Community Shields in that period from 2009 to 2018, a 9-year period. It's more historic. It's a longer term alleged period, and the nature of it is different because they're accused of artificially inflating sponsorships to help their financial fair play compliance. Very different to Forest and Everton. My final point is Chelsea. They are under investigation because the new regime self-reported financial irregularities that they found in relation to the previous regime. We don't have the details of that. They have not been charged yet, but it is another issue on the horizon. And going forward, slightly different to that, is that so many of these clubs, as we seem to talk about every week, are really conscious now of the teeth that these rules have because of everything we've described. And so they're trying to cut their cloth accordingly and balance the books. And that's why you're seeing partly why you're seeing very little spend in the January transfer window. You're seeing this trend, which you can argue it in an individual podcast about whether clubs should be having to sell their homegrown talent to maximize profit. Is that right? And so this is arguably, or definitely, one of the biggest subjects in the Premier League going forward.
Well, David, I know you've got to head off very quickly, so thank you so much for your time. And yeah, so much still to dig into as well. Nice one. See you soon. Paddy, you know, the Miami-based private investment firm 777, they're looking to take over Everton. I mean, what does this mean for that potential takeover?
I don't think, if we're referring to the PSR appeal, I don't think it matters a great deal. As we've reported previously, 777 would stand to pay less money to Farhad Moshiri if Everton were relegated. There's a load of performance-related clauses in that potential takeover deal. So it's not, I don't think it changes things dramatically with regards to their approval. The more pertinent issue for me is that we are still awaiting approval. They agreed the deal with Moshiri in the middle of September. And at the time of the announcement, we were given a guideline of around 12 weeks for the deal to be completed. Everton, in their own statement, said that they expected completion before the end of 2023.
Wow. Okay.
So obviously now in February, we're a lot further down the line than 12 weeks. I actually make it 24 now. So it's doubled. And we're still, as far as I understand it, not that much further down the line. They've had approval from the Financial Conduct Authority, I think assent from the Football Association, one of the other relevant bodies. Is considered more of a formality. The big one is the Premier League's owners and directors test. And one of the things the Premier League has done in recent weeks is write to 777 again, asking for clarity on certain points with regards to their takeover. They're effectively assessing whether 777 have the funds for the takeover, whether they got the funds for the club at large beyond the takeover, and a 3-year business plan. But I think it's safe to say that they've not had all the answers they want right now. And I think that's the more pertinent thing here. It's not about PSR and it's not about what it means for Farhad Moshiri, because frankly, given the mess he's put Everton in, who cares about Farhad Moshiri and what he gets financially as a result of this takeover? For me, it's about the future of the club and whether 777 are the right incumbents. And that's still up in the air from a Premier League perspective.
Well, gents, honestly, thank you so much for your time, David, Matt, and Paddy as well. And don't forget to rate and review the podcast, and we'll be back with another episode tomorrow. Thanks so much for listening. If you like this video, click subscribe for more content like this. We'll be joined by the likes of David Ornstein, Matt Slater, Adam Crafton, Carl Anker, and plenty more through the season to bring you the inside track to the biggest stories in football. If you'd like to listen to the full episodes for free, search the Athletic Football Podcast wherever you get your podcasts from.